Let's begin today by reviewing our 6 evidences. We're going to do a lot of science today. We're going to talk about DNA and mutations. All right, so these are the main supporting pillars of evolution. The 6 evidences. The Earth is billions of years old. What is that? It's an assumption in the evolutionary paradigm. It's not questioned. It has not been proven. What do they base it on? Well, the first thing they base the age of the Earth on is the need for it, right? We've got to have millions of years for this evolution to have occurred. But scientifically speaking, what are the 2 main supports for 4.6 billion years old? Radiometric dating and the idea of uniformitarianism. That is the foundation of having the Earth be 4.6 billion years old. Radiometric dating and uniformitarianism. So the Earth being billions of years old is an assumption that's not questioned, even though it has not been proven. The second evidence, both of these first 2 we're going to deal with in the next section on geology, but the fossil record is purported to be the best evidence, but it's not. What do they actually use to trace their evolutionary pathways? Evidence number 3, right? Homology or similarity of structures. So those are your first 3 evidences. The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. That's an assumption that we work from, not that we have proven. Number 2 is that the fossil record documents simple to complex, that it documents evolutionary progression. What do you see in the fossil record in reality? What 2 things? Can anybody give me one? Yes?
Death and destruction.
Yes, death and destruction. A lot of death and destruction. What was the first one?
Separate and distinct species.
Yes, and that's important. Separate and distinct species that do not change. They're in the fossil record or they're not in the fossil record. Okay, they appear, to use their terminology, as separate and distinct species. Fish is a fish, a seashell is a seashell, a nautilus is a nautilus, a trilobite is a trilobite. Okay, so that is a fallacy. The fossil record does not document simple to complex. We can't trace evolutionary pathways in the fossil record. All we see is death and destruction. Okay? Then we talked about homology, the actual main support and the main way that evolutionists pick evolutionary pathways, and the main ways they study evolution is through comparative analogy or homology. And that, of course, is a misinterpretation. Are there similarities? Yes. But evolutionists tend to overemphasize the similarities and de-emphasize the dissimilarities and say that, oh, because they're similar, they had to share a common ancestor. Okay, now we're ready to go through, there's the first 3. Now we're ready to go through the next 3. Planning on getting through 2 of them today. The fourth one, so the first one for today's lecture is that living things are fundamentally the same. Is that true? The next one, diversity and variety in the living world is the result of natural selection. Is that true? The last one is adaptation to environment is evolution in action. We'll deal with that on Monday. That's a misrepresentation of terminology. That's actually microevolution. Let's go back to evidence number 4. Living organisms are fundamentally the same. Let me ask you, is that true? Is it true? Yes, it's very true. But I'm calling this a misinterpretation. Here's the idea that you need to understand again. We have a creationist paradigm. Many people do not. They have an evolutionary paradigm. What is a paradigm? It's our basic belief that we use to interpret evidence for. I'm a creationist. I see similarities, whether it's homology, similarity of structure, or I see the fundamental unity of life. That's what we could call this, the fundamental unity of life. Living things are fundamentally the same at two levels, a cellular level and a molecular level. Okay? They are the same, but because I'm a creationist, I interpret that one way. I interpret that as common designer. If I were an evolutionist, I would interpret it differently. I would interpret it as evidence for a common what? Ancestor. So you have a choice in interpreting the facts. It is a fact that living things are fundamentally the same. There is a fundamental unity of life. How do you interpret that fact? You can interpret it as common designer or common ancestor. What determines which way you interpret it? Your worldview, your paradigm. Okay? So that's why I'm calling this a misinterpretation. Saying that because living things are fundamentally the same, they had to have evolved from a common ancestor, is simply an interpretation of evidence based on an evolutionary paradigm, not based on anything scientific, like a mechanism we've discovered. We can't explain in terms of gradualism how living things came to be. We can't explain the origin. All right, so this is a misinterpretation. Do you understand what I mean when I'm calling it a misinterpretation? Living things are the same at the cellular level and at the molecular level. I'm going to show you that in just a minute. But that doesn't mean it proves evolution. It also doesn't mean it proves creation. It doesn't prove either. Those are paradigms. They're outside the realm of operational science. They're historical sciences that are based on one's personal opinions, your paradigm, or even your worldview. So evidence number 4. First of all, living things are fundamentally the same. There is fundamental unity of life. How are they the same? The first point would be that all living things are composed of cells. It's called the cell theory. All living things are made up of cells. It doesn't matter if it's a human being, doesn't matter if it's a mammal, doesn't matter if it's a fish or a bird, doesn't matter if it's a plant, doesn't matter if it's an invertebrate, doesn't matter if it's bacteria. The basic unit of life is the cell. Also, cellular components, the parts that make up a cell, are uniform. Okay, there are basically two types of cells. Prokaryotic cells, which are bacteria, and then eukaryotic cells, which are all the rest of the cell types. Plant cells, animal cells, your cells, etc. Those are eukaryotic cells. So I'm talking about eukaryotic cells here. The picture that I had up, this is an animal cell. Okay, you can see that it has the same basic components. A eukaryotic cell has a plasma membrane, a eukaryotic cell has a nucleus, and a eukaryotic cell has cytoplasm. Okay, so when we're talking about similarities at the cellular level, first of all living things are made up of cells. It's called the cell theory. We could expand on the cell theory and say how cells only come from other cells. Right, so that's another problem for evolution. What's the origin of the first cell? But we're not talking about that today. So the cellular components are uniform. What are the 3 cellular components of a eukaryotic cell? What are they? Plasma membrane, nucleus, and cytoplasm. And not only are the components or the parts that make up the cells the same, basic structures, the processes done by cells are basically the same. There are 2 main processes in cellular life. Photosynthesis, which is done by plants, and cellular respiration, which is done by all cells. Cellular respiration is how cells convert glucose or other compounds, doesn't have to be glucose, how cells convert chemicals into energy. It's at the mitochondria of the cell. All of your cells do the same chemical processes. All types of plant cells do photosynthesis in much the same way. So we can study photosynthesis. We don't have to study photosynthesis in this plant, and then photosynthesis in that plant, and then photosynthesis in that plant. Photosynthesis is pretty uniform across the plant kingdom. So cellular components or parts that make them up are uniform, and cellular processes, both physical and chemical, are essentially the same. So is life fundamentally the same? Yes. But does that prove evolution? Does that prove we all came from the same ancestor? No. That's only one interpretation of similarities, common ancestor. The other, more credible interpretation is the one we're believing, correct? That we have a common designer. So just because things are similar, whether we're talking about homology, those are the overall structures, or we're even talking at the basic levels of life, just because things are the same does not prove or require that we all evolved from the same ancestral cell millions and millions and millions of years ago. So are living things fundamentally the same? Yes. They're fundamentally the same on a cellular level. Their cellular components are uniform. What are they? Plasma membrane, nucleus, cytoplasm. Okay? There's a little bit, let me take that same diagram and blow it up a little bit. You can see the nucleus. And this is an animal cell, so we have a nucleus and a nucleolus. The nucleus in all cells contains the DNA. That's across the board. Cellular components are uniform. And then in this particular cell, you can see this is the endoplasmic reticulum. These are very similar between all of your eukaryotic cells. Now there's differences between animal cells versus plant cells. But your animal cells are all basically the same, irregardless of species. Plant cells are all basically the same, irregardless of species. And then, so you can see, there's the plasma membrane, and it has a very particular structure. It's called the phospholipid bilayer. So here, not only are all living things made up of cells, cells are all basically the same. They all have the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and the plasma membrane. And if we look at the plasma membrane or the cell membrane, it's the same across the board. Look at the plasma membrane. It is a very classic structure, and it does not matter if it's a human cell, an animal cell, or a plant cell. Okay? And even your bacteria cells have the same basic structure of their plasma membrane. It's called the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, see it right there? Lipid bilayer. So it is true. Things are fundamentally the same. They are the same on a cellular level. Your cells are cell structure is pretty uniform across the species board. So they are the same. Why are they the same? Is that a question science can answer? No, we can't answer why they are the same in a scientific manner. What answers the question of why they are the same? What answers that question? Paradigm, worldview, your beliefs that you hold before you even look at the evidence. So science can't answer the question of why are things fundamentally the same, can they? We can't. So we can't prove evolution using similarity of cellular structure. Okay, so the plasma membrane is a detailed example of how cellular components, cell structure is very similar, and it doesn't matter if it's a human cell, an animal cell, a plant cell, even bacteria, which is a prokaryotic cell. It doesn't have a formed nucleus. It is much smaller. Okay, but it still has the phospholipid bilayer. And look at, it has these different proteins. Here's a more scientific looking structural representation. You can see here's the phospholipid bilayer right here. And these are the proteins in and out of the plasma membrane. And the plasma membrane is not just a membrane that sits there and does nothing. The plasma membrane is very dynamic. It controls what compounds are allowed into and out of the cell. So is this a simple structure? Is it? No, we could spend years of your life, you could spend years of your life just studying the structure of the plasma membrane. So I want you to understand that cells are not simple. We can kind of excuse Charles Darwin. Here's why we can excuse Charles Darwin. Did Charles Darwin have any idea how complex the cell actually was? In Charles Darwin's day, there was no field of genetics. So, can we excuse Charles Darwin? Yes. Why? That sounds like a quiz question. Why? That'll make you right. Okay. Just because it's not on the PowerPoint doesn't mean I don't want you to know it. Okay? This is important that you understand basic things. And it is true that life is fundamentally the same. It is true that cellular structure is pretty uniform, whether it's plants, animals, human cells, bacteria cells. And there's no such thing as simple cells. Okay? I can already see your eyes glassing over when I start getting into the scientific details here, because there is no such thing as simple life. And we can kind of excuse Charles Darwin. I mentioned in the previous lecture about Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. And that book has it's about biochemistry and how you can explain these complex biochemical processes with gradualism. Okay, and so we can excuse Charles Darwin because there was no field of genetics in 1850s, was there? There was no study of molecular biology, was there, like we have today? There was no sophisticated microscopes like the scanning electron microscope or the transmission electron microscope, and on the technology goes. Okay, so Charles Darwin had no idea about genetics. He had no idea about mutations. He also had no idea about cell biology and molecular biology. Those are all relatively new disciplines of science. So we can excuse him for some of his ideas, for his numerous successive slight modifications. I don't understand modern geneticists and their faith in evolutionary chance, their faith in mutations and natural selection and so forth. Okay, so there is no such thing as a simple cell. Life is very complex. And we could literally spend years of our life studying cell biology and still not understand it or be able to explain many cellular structures and cellular processes. All right, life is also fundamentally the same at a molecular level. Okay, so in Charles Darwin's day, no genetics, no cell biology, no molecular biology. Today, biology is studied on a molecular level. Okay, studying the homologous structures is kind of superficial. Now we study biology at a much more detailed molecular level. So all living things contain the same biomolecules. What are biomolecules? Biomolecules are molecules that are necessary for life, molecules that might be produced by living things, or molecules that make up living things. So biomolecule. Basically, there are 4 categories of biomolecules. You can see 3 of them as proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. The 4th one we're going to talk about in more detail. But just like all living things are made up of cells, those cells are made up of the same compounds. They are very complex. They're called macromolecules or biomolecules because they are associated with living things. They include proteins, carbohydrates, lipids. Okay, and whether it's just like the cellular components, whether it's a human cell, a plant cell, an animal cell, whatever it is, those biomolecules are essentially the same. A protein is a protein. And they're very similar in overall structure. They're made up of the same 20 amino acids and so forth. So they're very similar in makeup. Now they are highly complex and they're very specific. I don't want you to think that everything's the same, but in categories they are. We can put proteins in one category, and there's certain things that make a protein, and those proteins all have those characteristics. Now they will be very specific in function, they will be very specific in structure, and they have very specific uses, and they're found in very specific places. But a protein is still a protein. It's going to have the same makeup and characteristics no matter what its origin is. So all living things contain the same biomolecules, and those molecules are pretty much the same regardless of their origin, regardless of what organism they're found in. And then the fourth type of biomolecule is called nucleic acids. DNA is the main nucleic acid. All living things use the same material as their blueprint. The genetic blueprint is DNA. Here's a DNA molecule. DNA molecule is a fundamental biomolecule. It is the genetic information carrying molecule of all cells. So, is life fundamentally the same? Yes, it's the same at the cellular level and at the molecular level. Here's DNA. The structure of DNA was discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick. Okay, very famous, Watson and Crick. They discovered the basic structure of the DNA molecule was a sugar phosphate backbone, like the ribbon you see in the picture, that was twisted in a very classic shape called the double helix. So this DNA structure, this DNA molecule, is the same in living things. And all living things use DNA as their genetic blueprint. There are some viruses that are an exception to this. They may have RNA as their blueprint, but they're viruses. We're talking cells, and all cells use DNA as their genetic blueprint. Okay, so the genetic blueprint is DNA. DNA is the genetic information carrying molecule. It is technically called deoxyribonucleic acid. That's what the letters DNA stand for. Deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the fourth category of biomolecules. So again, our living things are fundamentally the same on a molecular level. They're all made up of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. And they all use DNA as their molecule of heredity. This is what the genes are actually made of, the DNA molecule. So again, the DNA molecule has a unique double helix shape. Double helix is like having a ladder with rungs in between and then twisted, a twisted ladder. It's called the double helix. James Watson, Francis Crick in the 1950s. And the DNA molecule contains the genetic code. DNA controls how the cell functions. It controls how the cell is made. It controls what proteins the cell can produce. It is the blueprint for all cells. So are cells fundamentally the same? Yes. They share the same molecular components, not just the same structural cellular components, they share the same molecular components. Okay? They're all made of the same or similar proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and they all use DNA as their blueprint. So DNA is a very important molecule for us to discuss with respect to evolution. Why? Because this is where mutations will occur. And according to gradualism, how did we get all the variety? According to evolution, the basis of all the variety that we see around us is in mutations. So we need to understand what mutations are, and to do that, that begins with understanding what is a gene. where is genetic information carried in the cell? The answer is in DNA. This is located in the nucleus of all of our cells, and all animal cells and all plant cells. So DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, has that unique double helix structure, and it contains the genetic code. It is a sequence of very specific molecules. These molecules are, chemically speaking, they're bases. They're called nitrogenous bases. But there are 4 different kinds of bases that make up DNA. They're called nucleotides. They're labeled A, T, C, and G. A, T, C, and G are the initials of their chemical names. A stands for adenine, T stands for thymine, C stands for cytosine, G stands for guanine. Not necessary for you to know that detail now, but just for you to understand the overall idea. DNA is a code that exists in the sequence of those nucleotides. And that code exists in triplets. 3 letters code for each building block that makes a protein. Those building blocks are called amino acids. Okay, so the molecular blueprint of cells is the DNA molecule. And DNA is a twisted ladder, and the rungs of that ladder are paired bases. A pairs with T, C with G. And the sequence tells the cell how to make proteins. And it tells the cell everything the cell needs to do and make to live. So it is the molecular blueprint. It is the genetic information carrying molecule. Okay, here it is in a little prettier picture. You can see this is the, overall we have the double helix, which is the twisted ladder. This is the backbone, and then right here, the rungs of the ladder. This molecule right here is diagrammed for you here. That's thymine. That's its chemical structure up here. And thymine is going to pair with adenine. See it right here? There's guanine, cytosines up there out of the picture. And the sequence down the ladder of the different molecules gives us the genetic code. And what happens, here it is in more detail, Watson and Crick literally figured out all the different atoms and how the structure came together. And it is literally a twisted ladder shape. The molecules come together in a twisted ladder shape. Here's T pairing with A. Here's C pairing with G. So you'd have T on one side of the ladder, A on the other. And that's the actual molecular structure of DNA. That's why Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize for spending essentially most of their lifetime developing and proving that this was the structure of DNA. So DNA is the genetic information molecule of the cell, and it is at the DNA that we have mutations. So let's draw some conclusions about evidence number 4. Are living things fundamentally the same? Yes, and they are essentially the same at both the cellular level and the molecular level. That's true, but our evidence is simply an interpretation. And how you interpret the similarities, whether it's homology from our previous lecture or whether it's on the cellular or molecular level, how you interpret the similarities depends on your worldview. Okay, a creationist sees similarities, whether it's similar limbs, similar bones, cells, or even molecules, and you're going to interpret them as having a common designer. They're all designed the same way. If you're an evolutionist, you're going to say they had to have evolved from each other. We can see it. They're similar, so they have to be somewhere. There has to be a common ancestor. So pick common designer, common ancestor. Okay, And again, I said earlier that there's no such thing as simplicity when we're talking about life. Life is very sophisticated, isn't it? It's very sophisticated in all of its processes and all of its structures. There's no such thing as a simple cell. And evolutionists tend to ignore the complexity because it's difficult to explain. Life is very complex at the molecular level. It's very complex at the cellular level. And evolutionists tend to ignore complexity because it's difficult to explain with gradualism. So, the complexity of living things is amazing, astounding, whatever you want to put there. And complexity, it's much more logical to think of complexity as being directed and designed rather than random mutations. So complexity is directed and designed. There's no question that life is very, very complex from whatever way we look at it. So gradualism, or the numerous successive slight modifications that Charles Darwin talked about, is inadequate to explain origins. We can show similarities all day. We can show similarities at different levels, but it does not explain the origin of those complexities. And this is the root of the intelligent design argument. This is why men like Michael Behe, a biochemist, says that gradualism cannot produce the complex molecules and the complex structures that are found everywhere in living things. Life is astoundingly complex, and gradualism cannot account for the complexities. Complexity must be directed and designed. That's where the intelligent design movement and the intelligent design argument came from. Evolutionists tried to downplay both the dissimilarities and the complexities of life. Then gradualism is woefully inadequate, giving mechanisms and steps of how the cellular or molecular level began in the first place. How did life begin? What's the evolutionary answer? What did we call it? Biochemical roulette. Does that idea fit with the complexity of life? It doesn't. It doesn't fit. Life is astoundingly complex, and gradualism does not provide the mechanisms. We can show similarities. We can't explain origins. Okay? And similarity does not prove common ancestry. Remember, science cannot answer why. And it's even having a real hard time with how. Okay? So we can't explain complexity. Evidence number 5 is very similar to evidence number 4. Diversity and variety in the living world is a result of natural selection. Why was Charles Darwin so important to evolution? Because he provided this mechanism. He provided a mechanism called natural selection to, in a sense, cloak evolutionary thought in science methodology. So, can we use those 3 steps of gradualism to explain diversity and variety? So, Darwin, his primary contribution is natural selection, which he documented extensively in his book, Origin of Species. So Darwin is important to evolution because he provided this mechanism, the mechanism of natural selection. Now, evidence number 5 also is a misinterpretation. Evidence number 4, are there similarities? Yes. And how we explain those similarities depends on our interpretation, which is based on our worldview. And the same thing is true with diversity and variety. Is there diversity and variety in the living world? Yes. How we interpret that depends on our worldview. So if we try to interpret diversity and variety as the result of natural selection or as natural selection in action, we are misinterpreting based on an evolutionary paradigm. That's why I'm calling this a misinterpretation. Is there variety in the living world? Well, of course there are. The question is, of course there is. The question is, what is the origin of that variety? You have a choice. Infinite creator or natural selection. Which one makes the most sense? I think, obviously, this is creation science, and obviously it makes more sense to me, and I want to show you that it should make more sense to you that our infinite creator is the source of the infinite variety that we see in the living kingdom, in the living world. So here's the 3 steps of gradualism. Variation by random mutations in the genes. Then natural selection promotes the survival of the best genes. So we have a mutation that alters the gene, and then natural selection chooses it, and then we have to have an accumulation of these little small steps. What did Darwin call them? Numerous, successive, slight modifications. Here's the mechanism. So my question is gradualism the source of all the variety? Do we get, evolutionists claim, you'll see it over and over again if you read evolutionary textbooks or look at evolutionary materials. They claim, state it, bold-faced fact, that mutations are the basis of variety. I almost renamed this evidence. Mutations are the basis of variety. Does that explain variety? Do mutations coupled with natural selection and then accumulation, does that explain everything we see around us? Evolutionists say it does. What do you say? All right, so how did this variety come to be? 2 choices. We have, remember, the infinite creator, or we have natural selection acting on mutations. So if I'm an evolutionist, my answer to variety is what? Mutations. If I'm a creationist, my answer to variety is God's design. So you have a choice. Mutations acted upon by natural selection, accumulating over millions of years. That's gradualism. Mutations acted upon by natural selection, accumulating over millions of years, gave us all these different life forms. We couldn't begin to even study one of the kingdoms or even one of the what are called phyla in the animal kingdom, could we? The diversity and variety is infinite. What are mutations? Here we are back to DNA. A mutation is when that genetic code is interrupted. The genetic code has to be a specific sequence of those A, T, C's, and G's. It's highly complex, it's highly specific. So a mutation is any time we have a permanent alteration in the DNA sequence that makes up a gene. I said permanent alteration. That's because your DNA can actually repair itself. So some mutations are actually repaired before they're even expressed. So a mutation is a permanent alteration in the gene sequence or the DNA sequence that makes up a gene. There are different types of mutations. A lot of mistakes can happen. We can have a point mutation, a deletion or insertion, a duplication, a translocation. A mutation is any time we alter the sequence of those A, T, C's, and G's. Point mutation. Mutations are supposed to be the answer to evolution. So we need to know what a mutation is and different ways mutations occur. One way a mutation can occur is by a point mutation, a change in a single base pair. There's our DNA molecule. There's the base pairing. See the sequence? We've got A, can't quite read that. Then here's the sequence going down the chain of the double helix. A point mutation is when we change a single base pair. Here's our mutation. We had the pair CG, and we have a change in the pair. You see, C and G always pair, they chemically bond. A and T chemically bond. So if we have one change, say, well, what's the big deal with one change? How many have ever heard of cystic fibrosis? Cystic fibrosis is a point mutation, single base pair change. And it causes a person with cystic fibrosis produces very sticky mucus. And they have all kinds of respiratory problems, digestive problems, and so forth. Point mutation. Deletion insertion. Here, they're kind of put in the same category. We can insert a base pair, or even a whole section of gene, or we can delete a whole section or a single base pair. They're put together because they have the same result. They result in what's called a frame shift. A frame shift is when you shift over the pairing so that it no longer lines up as correct codons. It would be like a misspelling in a paragraph. You insert a word, it throws the reading frame off. You insert a letter, it throws the reading frame off. That's the result of an insertion or a deletion. It doesn't matter if you put one in or take one out, it causes a frame shift. So you can see here's the original DNA sequence. And if we stick in an altered base pair, can't get all the way down there with the cursor, there we go. It's going to shift it. Look at what we've got here. These are amino acids that are being lined up and sequenced to produce a protein. And if we frame shift, we don't get the correct protein. Duplication, that's simply where we are duplicating portions of DNA and it disrupts the gene. The gene will not function. And what that gene code for can determine all kinds of different effects. So whatever the mutation is, natural selection fails as a mechanism. Here's why. Most mutations are not expressed. Your body is very good at repairing mistakes. Also, guess what? You have 46 chromosomes that exist in 23 pairs. So you have duplicate copy of all of your genes. Also, natural selection is looking for survival advantage. Natural selection kind of chooses against mutations. Mutation. If I were to call you a mutant, that's not very complimentary, is it? It implies harm. It implies distortion, and that's what mutations are. And actually, natural selection works against mutations to weed out mistakes, to weed out mutations. So, can we explain the origin of all the diversity and variety with this faulty mechanism? The answer is not when you examine it closely. On the surface, it looks good. On the surface, we can show natural selection. We can show adaptation to environment. But when you look at it closely, it fails as a mechanism. It cannot answer the question, what is the origin of all the variety? So, do mutations adequately explain variety? We talked about point mutations. We talked about frame shift caused by insertions and deletions. What do you think mutations do to genetic information? What happens to the code when there's a mutation? It becomes scrambled. It's like a misspelling. It's a typographical error. So what happens is mutations result in the loss of genetic information. So how in the world can they explain the origin of it? Do you see the problem? We lose genetic information. We scramble the genetic code when we have a mutation. So how can mutations be the origin of variety? How can it explain origins when it decreases rather than increases genetic information? And I already said most mutations are not expressed, and mutations may contribute to some variety, but they do not explain the origin of it. It's a nice mechanism. We can show how different things adapt to their environment, which is evidence number 6. These two are going to dovetail as well, but it does not explain the origin. It does not. Okay? there is a, what's that? Anybody know? That's a chromosome. Okay, and the DNA exists on chromosomes. It's all tightly coiled and impact in proteins. That is a chromosome. All right, evidence number 6 is where we'll pick up on Monday.